When John Adams died just a few hours later, his last words included an acknowledgement of his lifelong friend and rival, Thomas Jefferson survives.
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson was born on April 2nd, 1743 in Shadwell, Virginia, to one of the most prominent families in all of Virginia. His father was a successful farmer, a skilled surveyor, and a cartographer. He had 5 siblings, 2 older sisters, 2 younger sisters, and a younger brother. Thomas spent his childhood playing in the woods, practicing on his violin, and reading. Thomas studied law under George Wythe, and he was taught neatness, investigation system, and methods in business, which stuck with him for the rest of his life. Their bond of friendship was so close that when Wythe died in 1806, he left his entire library and study materials to his pupil and dear friend Thomas Jefferson. On May 29, 1763, Mr. Patrick Henry delivered his first great speech, and Jefferson was but a student. He stood in the doorway between the house and the lobby, where he heard the whole magnificent debate. He said, quote, "I remember well the cry of treason. If this be treason, then make the most of it," unquote. Thomas Jefferson became a lawyer in Virginia and began to practice law in 1769. During that same year, he entered into the House of Burgesses at 25 years old. On January 1st, 1772, Thomas finally got married to Martha Wallace Skelton, and they had 6 children together, but only 2 survived into adulthood. Martha, their firstborn, and Mary, their fourthborn. In June of 1775, Jefferson joined the Continental Congress as a delegate from Virginia. As the delegates were debating the vote for American independence, a committee of 5 of the top representatives were appointed to draft the actual document itself. This committee consisted of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, with Thomas Jefferson himself at the head. At only 32 years old, this is quite an honor for someone without even a formal education to hold such a dignified position. Over the next 17 days, Thomas drafted one of the most beautiful documents to liberty and equality in the history of the world. And he did it in his fair and neat hand. Finally, on July 4, 1776, Thomas Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence at the age of 32. Between 1777 and 1779, Mr. Jefferson was put to work alongside George Wythe and Edmund Pendleton to revise the laws back home in Virginia. During this time, these men would write 126 bills, many of which have outlasted the men who wrote them. On June 1st, 1779, Mr. Jefferson was chosen to serve as the governor of the state he had spent the previous 2 years helping to establish. During his time as the governor there of Virginia, Virginia got invaded 3 times by their enemies. He had very few resources and often had to depend on his own personal influence to obtain the necessary munitions of war. The 3rd invasion came after he had retired as governor, and the entire purpose of this attack was to surprise and capture the members of that assembly. Fortunately, Thomas Jefferson had been warned, and as the enemy was seen ascending up the hill leading to his mansion house, Thomas Jefferson mounted on his horse, and narrowly escaped out into the woods. In September of 1782, his lovely wife Martha, of over a decade, died from diabetes and her weakened health from childbirth. But before she passed, Martha forbade Thomas from ever remarrying. She could not bear the idea of another woman raising her children, and Thomas honored her request, and he remained a bachelor for the rest of his life, always keeping a small locket of her hair around his neck in a tiny little locket. After serving some time as minister to France, Thomas Jefferson returned home, and he ran for president in 1796, but he lost to John Adams. Jefferson did go on to serve as Adams' vice president, despite their differences. But this didn't lead to a productive partnership. So, to avoid the conflict, Thomas Jefferson stayed at his home, pursuing his peaceful life. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution was actually implemented to prevent such a situation from happening again, since the vice president can't do much good if his president is his archenemy. When the time came for a new election, Mr. Jefferson ran again for the presidency, and this time he won. In March of 1801, he took the oath of office, and he served for 2 full terms. Being nearly 66 years old, with 40 of those years having been devoted to public service, Thomas Jefferson finally felt that it was time to end his political career and focus on his personal work. So, on March 4th, 1809, he did just that. Shortly after retiring, Jefferson enlisted the help of his dear old friend James Madison to establish the University of Virginia. That day, by the appointment of heaven, was to be the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson had no wish to live beyond that day. It was the day which, 50 years before, he had helped to make immortal, and his wishes were answered. At 10 minutes before 1 o'clock, 12:50 p.m., at the age of 83, his final words were often cited as, "This is the 4th." When John Adams died just a few hours later, his last words included an acknowledgement of his lifelong friend and rival, Thomas Jefferson survives, though Adams was unaware that Jefferson had died so recently before him. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Thomas Jefferson, "In stature, he was 6 foot 2 inches high. His person was erect and well-formed, though spare. His color of his eyes was light, but they beamed with intelligence. In his manners, he was simple and unaffected, at the same time possessing no inconsiderable share of dignity. In disposition, he was uncommonly liberal and benevolent. In seasons of danger and perplexity, he exhibited no ordinary fortitude and strength of mind. His opinions were slowly formed, but yielded with great reluctance. Over his passions, he possessed uncommon control. In his domestic habits, he was quite simple. He rose early, and through the whole day was unusually diligent in his application, either to business or study. He was ardently devoted to literature and science, with almost every branch of which he was well acquainted. And so it remains to notice only one circumstance more. In private memorandum found among many other obituary papers and relics of Mr. Jefferson is a suggestion, in case a monument over him should ever be thought of, that a granite obelisk of small dimensions should be erected with the following inscription: "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson. author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statutes of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson is buried in the family cemetery at his homestead in a grave marked by a plain gray tombstone. The brief inscription was written exactly the way Thomas Jefferson wanted it. From his childhood in the woods playing his violin, to Patrick Henry's burning speech that lit the fire within him, to his very close and tender relationship and receiving the library of George Wythe, which, by the way, went on to be the basis of the Library of Congress when he sold his own personal library, some 6,487 books, to the Library of Congress. Thomas Jefferson always knew what needed to be done, and he diligently did it to the very end. I hope I can do the same with my life. The end.